Welcome to Sinister Truths, the channel where dark history, hidden stories, and unsettling realities come to light. Before we begin, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. In the year 1856, the Blue Ridge Mountains rose like an unbroken wall of stone and forest, their peaks wrapped in mist and silence. To most Americans, these mountains symbolized freedom, untamed wilderness, and opportunity. But to the enslaved men and women who lived in their shadow, the Blue Ridge was something far darker, a boundary between hope and despair, a place where escape seemed possible but survival felt almost impossible. On the eastern slopes of those mountains lived a man whose real name history would never record. Like so many enslaved people, his identity had been stripped away long before he ever thought of freedom. He was known only by a name given to him by his owner, a name that marked him as property, not as a person. It was spoken sharply when commands were issued, shouted when punishment followed, and ignored when pain silenced him. He was born into bondage sometime in the early 1830s, on land owned by a small but ruthless plantation family near the mountain foothills. Unlike the massive cotton plantations farther south, this land was rough and stubborn. Crops were thin, profits were uncertain, and so the enslaved laborers were driven harder, beaten more often, and fed less. Every sunrise brought labor that bent backs and broke spirits, clearing land, hauling timber, digging stone, and tending fields that refused to yield enough to satisfy their masters. From childhood, he learned that the world was divided cleanly into two parts, those who commanded and those who suffered. There was no middle ground. His earliest memories were of cracked hands and bleeding feet, of hunger that gnawed constantly, and of nights spent listening to the wind move through the mountains beyond the fields. Even as a boy, he noticed how the forest seemed endless, dark, dense, and alive with unseen movement. The mountains were always there, watching. By the time he reached adulthood, his body was hardened by years of physical punishment and relentless labor. He had scars across his back from whippings administered for offenses both real and imagined. He learned quickly that survival meant silence. Looking a white man in the eye could bring a beating. Asking for more food could mean being chained overnight. Resistance, no matter how small, was met with cruelty meant to crush not just the body, but the will. Yet something in him refused to die. Unlike others who surrendered completely to despair, he observed. He listened. He remembered. He memorized the terrain when sent to haul wood near the tree line. He noticed how the forest changed with the seasons, where water pooled after rain, which paths deer followed, which slopes were too steep for horses. While overseers saw only trees and shadows, he saw roots, cover, and possibilities. Still, escape was not a fantasy he indulged lightly. He had seen what happened to runaways. Some were dragged back half dead, their bodies mangled by dogs and thorns. Others vanished entirely, their fate whispered about. In hushed voices at night, the mountains did not guarantee freedom. They only promised uncertainty, but bondage promised only suffering. The plantation owner was a man hardened by greed and fear. Like many slaveholders near the frontier, he believed violence was the only language enslaved people understood. His paranoia grew with each passing year. Rumors of abolitionist movements, underground railroad activity, and slave revolts reached even these isolated lands. In response, punishments grew harsher. Patrols increased. The enslaved were watched constantly, as if freedom itself might rise from the soil if vigilance slipped. One summer evening, after a long day hauling timber, the man collapsed from exhaustion. Instead of aid, he received a brutal beating for laziness. The whip tore open old scars. Blood soaked into the dirt. As he lay there gasping for breath, staring at the sky between the trees, something inside him changed. Pain sharpened into clarity. Fear hardened into resolve. He realized then that if he stayed, death was only a matter of time. That night, he did not sleep. His body throbbed with pain, but his mind burned with thought. Every sound felt amplified. The chirp of insects, the distant howl of wolves, the rustle of leaves. Beyond the slave quarters, the mountains loomed, their dark outlines barely visible against the moonlit sky. For the first time, they did not seem like a threat. They seemed like an invitation. Over the following weeks, he began to prepare quietly. He took no reckless chances. He moved as he always had, obedient, silent, invisible. But in small moments, he gathered knowledge. He noted where tools were stored and which guards drank too much at night. He memorized patrol patterns. He studied the sky, learning how clouds and stars shifted before storms. Every enslaved person understood the danger of escape. But he understood something else too, the danger of staying. What made his situation even more unbearable was isolation. The plantation was small, and there were few others he could trust with his thoughts. Families were intentionally separated to prevent unity. Friendships were fragile, broken by sales and punishment. He carried his plan alone, knowing that even a whisper could mean death. The mountains offered no certainty, only the chance to choose his own fate. During daylight hours, he worked under the watchful eyes of overseers. At night he listened to old stories, whispered by elders. Tales of people who vanished into the wilderness, of spirits that protected the lost, of men who became part of the forest itself. Most dismissed these as fantasies meant to soothe suffering. He did not. He treated them as warnings and lessons. He learned which plants caused sickness and which eased pain. He learned that fire could be hidden, that smoke could be controlled. He learned patience, the kind that comes from knowing one mistake could cost everything. The Blue Ridge Mountains were unforgiving. Winters killed the unprepared. Predators stalked the weak. Hunger drove men mad. Slave catchers believed no escaped person could survive there long. That belief became his advantage. What they saw as a grave, he saw as a shield. By the fall of 1856, the plantation grew tense. Talk of escape circulated among the enslaved, though few dared act. Patrols were doubled. Dogs were trained. Owners slept with rifles nearby. But fear sharpened his resolve rather than dulling it. Fear, he realized, was the only thing his masters truly understood, and fear could be turned against them. He chose his moment carefully, not during a clear night when tracking would be easy, but during a storm when rain would erase footprints and wind would carry scent away. Nature itself would become his accomplice. When the night finally came, thunder rolled through the mountains like distant cannon fire. Rain fell in sheets, turning paths to mud. Guards retreated for shelter, cursing the weather. Inside the slave quarters, most huddled together, praying the storm would pass quickly. He did not pray. He moved. With nothing but a stolen blade, a piece of cloth, and the clothes on his back, he slipped away from the only life he had ever known. Each step carried him closer to freedom, or death. But for the first time the choice was his. As he crossed into the forest, the plantation lights disappeared behind him. The sounds of human cruelty faded, replaced by the living breath of the mountains. Branches clawed at him. Mud dragged at his feet. Pain screamed through his wounds. Still he did not stop. Behind him were chains. Ahead of him was the unknown. And in the dark heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a legend was about to be born. The storm arrived without mercy. Thunder cracked open the sky as if the mountains themselves were splitting apart. Rain poured in relentless sheets, hammering the earth, turning paths into rivers of mud and darkness. Wind howled through the trees, bending branches until they screamed. It was the kind of night that drove men indoors and animals deep into cover. The kind of night slave catchers cursed and patrols abandoned early. It was the perfect night to disappear. For hours the man waited, lying still on the rough wooden floor of the slave quarters, listening. Each sound mattered. The drunken laughter of a guard stumbling away, the slam of a door, the distant rumble of thunder masking smaller noises. Every second stretched endlessly, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it might betray him. He had chosen this night weeks ago, though he could not have known exactly when the storm would come. He had only known that it must. Clear nights favored the hunters. Moonlight revealed footprints. Dogs followed scent with ease. But storms erased evidence, confused animals, and discouraged pursuit. Nature itself became a shield. When the rain intensified, he rose. There was no farewell, no final look back. He knew better. Nostalgia weakened. Resolve. Every memory of suffering threatened to slow him down. So he moved with purpose, his body aching from old wounds, his back still marked by scars that burned whenever he breathed too deeply. He slipped through the door and into the night. The plantation that had once seemed vast now felt small behind him. Lanterns glowed faintly through rain-blurred air. The overseer's house stood silent, windows dark. Horses huddled in their shelter, uneasy but unmoving. No one noticed the absence of one enslaved man among many. Absence, he had learned, was the one thing slavery trained people to ignore. He kept low, hugging shadows, letting rain soak him completely. Mud sucked at his feet, threatening to pull him down. Twice he nearly slipped, catching himself just in time. Each misstep sent a surge of panic through his chest. Panic was deadly. Panic made noise. He moved slowly, deliberately, counting steps in his head. At the edge of the fields the ground changed. Grass gave way to roots, soil hardened, the forest loomed ahead, dark, dense, and alive. Trees rose like silent sentinels, their branches tangled so tightly they swallowed what little light remained. This was the boundary few dared cross. Beyond it lay no roads, no houses, no mercy. He crossed it without hesitation. The moment he entered the forest, the sounds of the plantation faded. The rain sounded different beneath the canopy, softer, more chaotic, broken by leaves and branches. The wind no longer howled freely. It whispered, twisted, and circled. The world narrowed to what he could feel beneath his feet and hear in his breath. Fear followed him into the trees, but it changed shape. On the plantation, fear was constant, crushing, inescapable. Here, fear sharpened his senses. It made him alert. Alive, he did not run. Running left obvious tracks and drained energy. Instead, he walked quickly, placing his feet carefully, avoiding open ground. He crossed streams deliberately, wading upstream for several yards before exiting at an angle to confuse scent. He brushed against brush and low branches, letting rainwater wash away any trace of his passage. These were not instincts learned in a single night. These were lessons gathered over years of observation, whispered stories, and quiet preparation. Behind him, slavery still slept. Ahead of him, survival waited. As the storm intensified, so did the forest. Trees groaned under the wind. Branches snapped and crashed somewhere in the darkness. Animals fled or hunkered down. The man stumbled once, falling hard against a tree, knocking the breath from his lungs. Pain flared across his ribs, white-hot and blinding. He stayed down for a long moment, pressing his face into wet leaves, listening. Nothing followed. No shouts, no dogs, no gunshots tearing through the rain. He forced himself upright and continued. Hours passed, though time lost meaning. The forest had no clocks. His body measured progress in pain and exhaustion. Hunger nawe. D at him already. Cold crept into his bones as soaked clothing clung to his skin. Still, he pushed forward, driven by something deeper than fear. He climbed. The terrain grew steeper as he moved toward the mountains. Slopes rose sharply, littered with rocks slick from rain. Each step required balance and care. A fall here could mean broken bones, death by exposure or discovery. The higher he went, the less familiar the land became. He had been sent near the tree line before, but never this deep. The forest thickened, paths vanished, the world reduced itself to roots, stone, and shadow. At one point he heard it, a sound that froze his blood, a howl, distant, carried by wind and rain but unmistakable. Wolves, or dogs. In that moment the difference hardly mattered. Both meant teeth, pursuit, and death if he failed. He pressed himself against a rock outcropping, holding his breath, listening. The howl echoed again, then faded. Whether the animals had caught his scent or were calling to one another, he could not know. He did not wait to find out. Moving uphill, he followed a narrow ridge where water ran off quickly, leaving fewer tracks. The storm worked in his favor, washing away footprints almost as soon as they formed. Still, he knew the real danger would come at dawn. If his escape was discovered. If the dogs were brought out. If the hunters were determined. He pushed on through the night, driven by the knowledge that every step gained was distance they would have to fight for. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion nearly claimed him. His legs trembled uncontrollably. His vision blurred. Every breath burned his lungs. He found a shallow depression beneath a fallen tree, partially shielded from the rain, and collapsed. He did not sleep fully. True sleep would have been dangerous, but drifted in and out of awareness, jerking awake at every sound. In the gray light of early morning, the storm began to weaken. Rain slowed to a drizzle. Fog crept through the forest, thick and heavy, wrapping the trees in ghostly silence. He rose again. The world looked different in daylight. Still hostile, still dangerous, but clearer. He drank from a stream, careful to move upstream first. The cold water revived him briefly, numbing hunger and pain. Then he heard it. Shouts. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. They had discovered his absence. The hunt had begun. Adrenaline surged through him, banishing exhaustion. He moved deeper into the mountains, choosing routes no horse could follow. He scrambled over rocks, crawled beneath tangled brush, and crossed water repeatedly. His body became a tool, cut, bruised, bleeding, but relentless. At one point, he glimpsed movement below, a line of men with rifles, their voices carried upward by the slope. Dogs strained at their leashes, confused by rain and crossing streams. The hunters moved cautiously, frustrated, angry. Fear became his ally. He knew their fear. He had seen it in overseers' eyes whenever Contro. El slipped, even briefly. White men feared what they could not dominate, and the mountains belonged to no one. By midday, the hunters slowed. The terrain punished them. Horses could not proceed. Dogs lost the trail repeatedly. Each hour that passed drained their resolve. By nightfall, they would give up. He only had to survive. As dusk approached, he reached higher ground where the forest thinned slightly. From there, he looked back once, just once. The land stretched out below him, hazy and distant. Somewhere beyond the hills lay the plantation, already shrinking into memory. He felt no triumph, only relief, and something else, a realization. He was alone now, truly alone. No rules, no orders, no protection. The world would not feed him or shelter him unless he learned to take what he needed. Freedom, he understood, was not safety. It was responsibility. As night fell again, he vanished deeper into the Blue Ridge Mountains, leaving behind not just chains, but the man he had been forced to become. By the time the hunters turned back, defeated and exhausted, the mountains had already claimed him, and they would never give him back. The mountains did not welcome him. They tested him. In the first days after the hunt faded and human voices vanished from the valleys below, the man discovered a truth no one had ever taught him. Freedom was not gentle. It did not offer comfort or certainty. It demanded payment in pain, patience, and blood. Every hour in the wilderness forced him to prove that he deserved to remain alive. The forest was louder now that he was no longer running. Without the constant roar of fear in his ears, he began to hear the mountains speak, not in words, but in warning signs and subtle rhythms. Wind carried messages. Birds announced movement. Silence meant danger. He learned quickly that stillness could save his life. During daylight, he avoided open ground. He rested beneath dense cover, camouflaging his body with mud and leaves. The memory of dogs snapping at chains haunted him. Even now, he imagined their breath behind him. Though the hunters had given up, the fear of discovery never fully left him. Fear, he realized, kept him alert. Hunger came first. By the second day, weakness spread through his limbs. His stomach cramped violently, folding him in half. He had stolen nothing but a blade and scraps of cloth. There were no rations, no mercy. The plantation, cruel as it was, had at least provided food. Here, every meal had to be earned. He remembered fragments of whispered knowledge, old men muttering about roots that killed and berries that healed. He tested cautiously, chewing the smallest pieces, waiting, watching his body for signs of sickness. Once he vomited violently after tasting a pale mushroom. Another time his tongue burned for hours from sap that should never touch flesh. The mountain punished ignorance. Gradually he learned, acorns soaked and roasted, berries eaten only when birds fed freely, fizz. Trapped in narrow streams using stone weirs, squirrels taken with snares made from twisted fibers and patience. But unmistakable. Instinct screamed at him to flee, but curiosity held him still. He watched from cover as a lone white trapper emerged, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The man looked tired, dirty, human. For a long moment the runaway considered revealing himself. Hunger and isolation tempted him, but fear won. Trust, he knew, could kill faster than starvation. He slipped away silently, leaving the trapper unaware that death, or freedom, had watched him pass. From then on, he avoided all signs of people. Humans meant chains, bullets, or betrayal. Animals, at least, followed rules. The mountains reshaped his mind as much as his body. Without constant commands and punishment, his thoughts grew clearer. Memories of abuse surfaced, raw and painful. Anger burned hot, then cooled into something sharper. He did not fantasize about forgiveness. He fantasized about never being powerless again. By the time the first winter winds began to cut through the trees, he understood a brutal truth. Survival alone was not enough. He could live like this for a season, maybe two. But sooner or later, illness, injury, or chance would end him. He needed shelter, not just a hiding place, but a stronghold. The idea came slowly, shaped by necessity. A place high enough to avoid patrols, hidden enough to escape notice, defensible enough to protect him if found. The mountains offered such places to those who knew where to look. He began scouting deliberately, studying cliffs, ravines, and ridgelines. He tested caves and abandoned animal dens, rejecting those too exposed or unstable. Eventually, he found it. a narrow shelf tucked against a rock face, shielded by dense trees and overlooking a steep drop. It was perfect. From there he could see without being seen. Approaches were limited. Sound traveled upward. Anyone climbing toward it would be exhausted long before reaching the top. He claimed it silently. The construction was slow, painful work. He used fallen logs, stone, mud, and patience. No nails. No tools beyond his blade and hands. Each piece was placed carefully. The structure blended with its surroundings, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It was not yet a fortress, but it was the beginning. As he worked, he thought about the world below, the plantation, the men who believed him dead or broken, the system that had devoured his past. He did not know if he would ever leave the mountains. He did not know if freedom waited beyond them. But he knew this: no one would ever own him again. The mountains had stripped him down to nothing and rebuilt him into something dangerous, something patient, something the world was not prepared to face. And in the shadows of the Blue Ridge, the wild was no longer his enemy. It was his ally. The first winter wind reached the high ridges like a blade. It cut through trees, scraped across stone, and found every weakness in the man's shelter. The crude structure he had begun, nothing more than stacked logs and packed earth, groaned under the pressure. Cold crept in through unseen gaps, settling deep into his bones. That night, as he huddled beside a weak, hidden flame, he understood something with perfect clarity. The mountains had taught him how to survive. Now they were teaching him how to build. Shelter was no longer a convenience. It was a line between life and death. At dawn he rose stiff and aching, breath fogging in the air, frost-coated leaves and stone like a warning. He studied his surroundings with new eyes, not as a fugitive seeking cover, but as a defender choosing ground. The narrow shelf against the rock face offered everything he needed: height, concealment, and control. Anyone approaching would be forced uphill, exposed and exhausted before ever seeing him. This would not be just a hiding place. It would be a stronghold. Construction became his purpose. Each day followed a rhythm shaped by survival. At first light he scouted for materials: fallen trees, broken stone, clay-rich soil. He avoided cutting live wood when possible. Fresh scars on trees were signs humans could follow. Instead, he used what the forest had already discarded. Logs were dragged inch by inch, muscles screaming in protest. Stones were pried loose with his blade and bare hands. Mud was mixed with ash and pine resin to create a crude mortar. Every movement was slow, deliberate, silent. Pain was constant, but pain no longer frightened him. It meant he was alive. The shack began to take shape. Its walls were thick, uneven, built to blend into the rock face behind it. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than another shadow among shadows. He angled the entrance away from the slope below, forcing any approach to curve awkwardly along the ridge. A narrow doorway limited how many could enter at once. Inside, the space was small, barely enough to lie down, but defensible. He carved narrow slits into the walls, just wide enough to see through, too narrow for a bullet to enter easily. From inside, he could observe the forest without revealing his presence. From outside, the shack remained almost invisible. The mountain approved, but shelter alone was not enough. The man had learned that humans were far more dangerous than animals. Predators followed instinct. Men followed fear, greed, and cruelty. If discovered, his refuge would be tested not by weather, but by violence, so he prepared for that too. Around the shack he began laying traps, not elaborate contraptions, but simple, brutal devices born of patience and understanding. Pits disguised with leaves and soil. Sharpened stakes hidden beneath brush. Stones stacked carefully above narrow paths, ready to be loosened with a pull of cord. Each trap was placed with intention, not to kill indiscriminately, but to slow, injure, and terrify. He wanted intruders to feel watched, hunted, uncertain. Fear, he knew, did more damage than wounds. As weeks passed, the shack became an extension of himself. He memorized every creak, every loose stone, every line of sight. In darkness, he could move through it silently, navigating by touch alone. The space felt alive, responsive, protective. It was the first thing he had ever built that belonged solely to him. Inside, he stored what little he possessed: dried meat, tools fashioned from bone and stone, strips of cloth, carefully preserved embers for fire. He learned to cook without smoke, to vent heat through hidden channels that blended with the rock. From below, no sign of life betrayed him. From within, he could see everything. Loneliness crept in slowly, The mountains gave him safety, but they offered no companionship. Days passed without hearing a human voice. Ived storms that would have killed him in the open. When spring finally came, it felt earned. With the thaw came movement. More people ventured into the mountains, some hunting, some searching, some driven by rumor. Each time the man watched. He never attacked without cause. He never pursued. His goal was not domination. It was deterrence. The shack stood as a warning: approach, and the mountain itself will turn against you. Still, something shifted inside him. The more fear he inspired, the more he realized the balance of power had changed. He was no longer prey. He was no longer running. Men with rifles moved cautiously now. They whispered. They hesitated. The system that had once hunted him without mercy now feared what it could not control. At night, sitting in the dim glow of hidden firelight, he wondered what this made him: monster, rebel, survivor. He did not dwell on morality. Morality had never protected him. Strength and awareness had. The shack was proof of that. One evening, as the sun bled red through the trees, he stood outside his shelter and looked down at the world below. Somewhere beyond the ridges were plantations, laws, chains, and men who believed themselves masters. Up here those rules did not apply. The shack blended into the mountain, silent and patient. A fortress not of stone and iron, but of knowledge and resolve. Built by a man the world had tried to erase. And now, anyone who dared climb toward it would learn the same lesson he had learned long ago. The mountains do not belong to the powerful. They belong to those who endure. Word travels differently in the mountains, not by newspapers, not by official decree, not even by the slow, formal channels of towns or plantations. Here stories traveled like smoke on the wind, fragmented, exaggerated, terrifying. A bark of a dog, a distant scream, a vanished trapper. Each became evidence of something unseen, something deadly, something alive in the Blue Ridge that no man could claim. The man in the shack did not intend to create a legend. He intended only to survive. But survival in the mountains, especially when paired with cunning, inevitably inspires stories. Humans cannot help but fill the gaps in knowledge with fear. And the unknown is always darker than the known. It began with hunters. At first they came in small numbers, 2, 3 men at a time, hoping to claim the bounty for the runaway or recover a lost property. Some were local trappers. Some were overseers sent on their own reconnaissance. The man in the shack did not chase them, did not confront them directly. He waited. He observed. He allowed the terrain itself to punish the unwise. One misstep, one poorly placed foot, and a trap claimed its victim, leaving nothing but terror and rumor behind. Stories spread faster than facts. "I saw him," one hunter would say, perched on a ridge, eyes glowing, moving like the wind. "He vanished before my rifle even came up," another claimed, shaking in his belief. "They say he strikes only when the moon is hidden behind clouds," whispered a third, each tale growing darker, each version more monstrous than the last. Even dogs began to fail. Hounds that could follow a fox through dense underbrush would falter on his scent. They refused to cross certain ridges, barking frantically or turning back as if an invisible force forbade them. The hunters began to believe the mountains themselves had chosen him, that he was a creature of the wild and not a man at all. The legend seeped into nearby towns and settlements. Merchants whispered in markets. Children huddled around fires listening to exaggerated tales. Farmers avoided the higher ridges, claiming they heard strange howls at night or saw lights flickering from nowhere. Even the most skeptical townsfolk began to notice patterns: missing trappers, abandoned hunting parties, strange signs carved into tree trunks that no one dared approach too closely. And yet, none could deny the facts. Men had disappeared. Lives were ruined or left in chaos. Hunters returned broken, humiliated, terrified. Stories told of a man, perhaps more than a man, who could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish like smoke. Some spoke of him as a ghost. Others, with hushed awe, called him a spirit of vengeance. Meanwhile, the man in the shack remained mostly indifferent to the reputation spreading below. To him, rumor was irrelevant. He had no desire for fame or fear. He desired only freedom, safety, and the knowledge that the chains of his past could never touch him again. But he understood the utility of legend. Fear is a weapon, and humans are always influenced by it. One day, a small group of hunters made the mistake of venturing too close to the lower slopes of his ridge. They moved carefully, armed, and confident that no trap could be hidden in the thick underbrush. They were wrong. A simple pit, covered with leaves and mud, swallowed one hunter entirely. leaving only a foot and a scream that would echo in the minds of those left behind. The others fled, and word spread quickly. This mountain man was no ordinary escapee. He was cunning, patient, deadly if provoked. Each survivor added to the story, embellishing details with fear, turning him into something less human, more mythic. Stories became warnings. Parents told their children to avoid the ridges. Hunters learned to respect certain paths as forbidden. Even the local militia hesitated to patrol the mountain, dismissing the man as more than human. By now, his legend was untouchable, spreading faster than any man could run, growing with every terrified recounting of near encounters. He did not interfere directly, but he did not need to. The forest, the cliffs, the traps, and his own cunning carried his influence into the hearts of men far below. The shack had become a symbol of defiance, and the man inside had become a cautionary tale, a warning that survival was not passive, that freedom once sees. Ed demanded vigilance, cruelty when necessary, and above all, knowledge. The mountain's reputation began to attract attention beyond local settlements. Travelers, adventurers, and thrill-seekers came to glimpse the feared ghost of the Blue Ridge, drawn by curiosity and the thrill of danger. Many disappeared. Some were found days later, lost, terrified, and unable to describe clearly what they had seen. Others vanished entirely, leaving only faint footprints or rumors of strange shadowy figures watching them silently from the treetops. Even the enslaved below the mountains learned his name, or at least what they believed it to be. Among the enslaved he became a symbol of possibility. Whispers spread in quarters at night, a spark of hope for those trapped in chains. If one man could escape, survive, and thrive, perhaps others might dream of the same. The shack in the mountains was more than a shelter. It was a statement. Resistance was possible. Escape was not just fantasy, but with fame, even unwanted, came danger. Hunters began to arrive in organized groups. They carried rifles, dogs, ropes, and equipment designed to flush him out. They underestimated the man, believing brute force would suffice. They failed spectacularly. He had learned the terrain in every season, memorized every hidden path, and perfected the use of his traps. Each attack was met with silence, strategy, and sometimes violence. Each failure amplified his legend. By now he had mastered the balance between presence and invisibility. From within his shack, he could observe the mountains like a king surveying a vast, wild kingdom. He did not need to move to dominate. Men feared him because they did not know where he would strike, or if they would ever see him again. Rumors flourished, a shadow slipping between trees, eyes glowing in the night, whispers carried on the wind. The man in the shack did not correct these stories. He let them grow, for fear was more powerful than steel, and fear, once planted, is impossible to erase. As winter turned to spring, the cycle repeated. Hunters came, rumors spread, survivors returned with tales more grotesque than the last. The legend became self-sustaining. Every disappearance, every frightened retelling, every misstep by a curious traveler added another layer to the story. Soon, it was impossible to separate reality from myth. By the end of his first year in the mountains, the man had not only survived, he had transformed the perception of the Blue Ridge itself. To those below, it had become a place of danger, mystery, and dread. To him, it was home, safe, silent, watching, and in that silence he planned, not vengeance yet, not outright, but awareness, knowledge that men could be manipulated by fear, that the very chains meant to hold him now served another purpose. They shaped the minds of his enemies before he ever touched them. His shack was no longer merely a refuge, it was a citadel of strategy, a hub from which the world below could be controlled indirectly through uncertainty, rumors, and terror. By the second year, even the most skeptical trappers avoided the ridges entirely. The mountains had claimed him, and in turn, he had claimed the mountains. He moved freely, hunting, gathering, and fortifying. The shack grew stronger, more complex. Slits became passages, traps became elaborate deterrents, and all the while, he watched the world below, invisible, untouchable, and feared. The legend of the mountain man had arrived. Men whispered his name when they dared, told stories around fires, warned children of venturing too high. He was more than a man. He was a symbol, a shadow in the Blue Ridge Mountains that no one could touch, a living testament to survival, cunning, and the power of fear. The mountains had watched him long enough. After years of hiding, hunting, and surviving, he no longer needed only to evade. The shack had transformed him. Isolation had sharpened his instincts, honed his cunning, and taught him patience that bordered on the supernatural. Each hunter who came and failed, each story that grew in terror below, had added to a deep, simmering understanding. Fear could be weaponized, knowledge could be weaponized, and he, the man who had once been owned, could finally strike on his terms, but the question remained. Would he act for revenge, or simply resist? Revenge demanded risk. Resistance demanded patience. Both required a mastery of fear, cunning, and the environment that only he now possessed. It began quietly. Hunters, increasingly desperate to reclaim their perceived property, ventured further into the mountains. They came in organized groups, heavily armed, believing brute force could succeed where subtlety had failed. But the man had become a ghost in the wilderness. Every trap, every ridge, every hidden path was now second nature to him. He knew the mountains better than anyone who pursued him. The first confrontation came one gray dawn. 3 hunters had set up camp below his shack, believing the high ridges too treacherous to navigate. They lit a fire, laughing, confident, underestimating both the weather and the man who had mastered the forest. From above, he watched silently, concealed behind a sheer rock face and dense brush. The hunters were oblivious. They did not hear the wind-shifted leaves, the faint scuttle of small animals disturbed by his movement, the subtle changes in the earth that warned of hidden traps. He did not strike immediately. Instead, he studied them. He listened to their patterns, their conversations, the rhythm of their movements. In this patience, he became predator and observer simultaneously. His mind replayed centuries of cruelty, each memory sharpening his focus. He thought of the whip, of the chains, of every humiliating command he had endured. And yet, he did not act out of blind rage. He acted out of strategy. A branch snapped somewhere below, subtle but loud enough to draw attention. The hunters froze. They glanced around, rifles raised, eyes wide. One of them stepped toward the sound, footfalls heavy. Then, the pit, covered with leaves and thin branches, positioned perfectly along the hunter's path, opened beneath him. A scream pierced the morning air. The other 2 panicked, scattering blindly as he manipulated fallen stones to dislodge and unbalance them. In that moment, the shack above was more than a home. It was a fortress. And the man within it was no longer a mere survivor. He was an arbiter of the mountains. The hunters fled, wounded and terrified, but not entirely defeated. Word spread, as it always did, amplifying the legend. Rumors now included violent details: hunters impaled, rifles crushed, screams echoing through the trees with no visible assailant. In their terror, the humans below began to imagine him as something beyond human, a demon of the woods, a specter that punished those who dared to enter his domain. And yet, to the man, this was only the beginning. He realized that revenge, if wielded too early or too indiscriminately, could expose him. But controlled, precise action could serve a dual purpose: survival and psychological dominance. The mountains were not merely shelter, they were weapon, stage, and sanctuary. From this position he could dismantle fear and authority simultaneously. Every hunter who came to challenge him was a pawn in a larger game, a demonstration of the consequences of underestimating someone who had already been broken and rebuilt. Winter gave way to spring. Streams swelled with melted snow, paths shifted, and visibility changed. Each season brought new lessons. He learned how to manipulate water flow to create natural traps. He diverted small streams into pits. He placed logs at angles to fall with a subtle push. Every element of the mountain became a part of him, and he became a part of it. Hunters increasingly came in larger groups, some accompanied by dogs, others carrying heavier rifles and chains. Yet no one succeeded. The more they tried, the more terrified they became, and each failure, each whispered account from those who barely survived, fed the legend further. By now, even the most hardened locals hesitated to travel the ridges. Merchants, trappers, and plantation overseers spoke of him in hushed tones, warning each other not to approach. "He waits," they said. "He knows where you walk before you walk it. He watches. He waits." Some claimed they saw a shadow slip between the trees, larger than any man, moving without sound, always just beyond reach. Others claimed their dogs refused to track, turning back suddenly as if the forest itself protected him. Fear became a weapon that required no hands. But with strategy came morality, or a shifting understanding of it. The man questioned himself in the cold nights by his hidden fire. Was this vengeance, or was it resistance? He thought of the chains, of whips tearing into flesh, of nights spent shivering in quarters while RS slept warm. He thought of the children who had been sold away from their mothers, of friends beaten into submission. These thoughts fueled the fire inside him, yet he restrained it. He struck only when necessary. He allowed nature, cunning, and fear to do most of the work. When humans fell into pits, into traps, or simply fled, it was never by accident, it was by his design. But he never hunted indiscriminately. His goal was survival first, assertion second, vengeance only when unavoidable. It was in this careful calibration that he became something more than a man, a legend. Over time, the shack and its master became intertwined in the consciousness of the surrounding population. Children spoke of him as a dark spirit of the mountains. Hunters whispered of his inhuman awareness. Even the enslaved in nearby plantations told stories by candlelight of a man who had escaped, survived, and now watched the mountains, untouchable. These tales inspired both awe and terror, spreading faster than any factual account could. He embraced this. Fear was a shield. Rumor was a weapon. The world below had underestimated him for too long. No one could challenge the shack without consequence. No one could enter the mountains unprepared. And as he surveyed the peaks from his vantage point, he realized a simple truth. He had become the master of the mountains, in the way his masters had never imagined. And yet, he remained human in his solitude. At night, he thought of the life he had lost, not the work or the suffering, but the connections, the friendships, the simple moments of trust and warmth. Rage was tempered by reflection. Revenge was tempered by patience. The shack had not just saved his life, it had changed his mind, reshaped his strategies, and clarified his purpose. By the second year of living in the mountains, the man had fully embraced both roles, survivor and avenger. He had proven, through cunning, patience, and strategic use of the terrain, that he could confront his oppressors without being caught. Every encounter, every trap, every rumor reinforced this truth. He was no longer prey. He was a force the world below could neither predict nor control. Some nights, he allowed himself to imagine leaving the mountains and returning to confront his old masters directly. But he always dismissed the thought. The shack represented something greater than revenge. It represented autonomy, mastery, and the transformation of fear into power. The humans below had a lesson to learn. Freedom, once seized, cannot be contained. And the mountains, silent witnesses to all, had chosen him as their instrument. Time in the mountains has no measure but seasons, and memory becomes both companion and tormentor. By the third year of his isolation, the man who had once been a slave, hunted and broken, had become more myth than flesh in the minds of those who whispered of him below. Yet he remained very real, very alive, and increasingly aware that every day, every movement, every breath was both victory and preparation. The shack, his fortress of wood, stone, and cunning, had endured seasons of rain, snow, and wind. Its walls had been reinforced repeatedly, hidden carefully, traps reset or replaced, sightlines adjusted. The mountains had molded him as much as he had molded the land around him. He had become invisible to human eyes, yet every tree, every rock, every path bore the mark of his intelligence, and still he wondered about the outside world. He had seen enough fear to know its power. Hunters came, spread rumors, retreated, and returned broken. Yet, in the deep hours of night, when frost painted the forest and the wind howled through the ridges, he felt the pull of curiosity, and perhaps a dangerous longing. What lay beyond the peaks he had claimed? Could he ever truly leave the mountains, even if he wished to? One spring morning, he noticed movement unlike before. A small group of men, larger and more determined than those who had ventured up the slopes in previous years. Word must have reached them. Rumors carried by frightened survivors, by merchants, by travelers. They carried ropes, rifles, and confidence born of disbelief, believing the stories of the mountain man to be exaggeration, superstition. He watched them from a hidden perch, studying their patterns. Their movements were sloppy compared to the discipline of his life in the mountains. They underestimated not just him, but the environment that had become his ally. And yet, he could sense an increasing risk. The mountain could protect him, but overconfidence or a sudden misstep could betray him. So he prepared. He checked every trap, reinforced weak points, and studied the weather and terrain. He would not strike recklessly. He had learned that survival was more than skill. It was patience, cunning, and knowing when to act, or disappear. When the men arrived near his ridge, He watched silently as they struggled through streams, mud, and dense undergrowth. He could see fear begin to ripple among them, though they did not yet understand why. Two of the hunters disappeared into a pit he had carefully concealed. The others froze, rifles raised, shouting at shadows that did not move. But he did not appear. Not yet. Days passed. The men retreated, only to return with reinforcements, carrying ladders, ropes, and more rifles. Their efforts grew bolder, more desperate, and with each attempt he noticed a subtle pattern. They had learned some lessons, adapted in ways he had not expected. Survival in the mountains was no longer just his game. It had become theirs too. At this point, he began to feel the first true pangs of mortality, not from age, but from circumstance. His strength remained remarkable, but the relentless vigilance, the injuries of past years, and the weight of solitude pressed upon him. He realized something no one else could know. No fortress, no traps, no cunning could last forever. One mistake, one unforeseen event, could end him, or at least force him to leave the only home he had ever truly made for himself, and so he began to plan his disappearance. The thought was born not of fear, but of strategy. He understood that legends survive longer than men. If he vanished completely, leaving only his story behind, the mountains themselves would tell the tale. Fear would continue to spread. Myth would endure. The shack, no longer a home but a symbol, could remain even if he did not. Preparation took weeks. Every trap, every path, every tree was checked and adjusted. He stored supplies in hidden caches along secondary ridges, ensuring that if he needed to leave quickly, the essentials for survival would follow him without revealing his exact position. He observed the hunters' patterns, noting when they slept, when they moved, how they divided into groups. He did not strike. He could have, easily. But striking would leave traces, clues, and the story of his survival might end with blood instead of legend. The night he chose to vanish was cold and clear. Stars glittered through the trees, moonlight faintly illuminating paths he had walked for years. He packed only what he could carry on his back, and extinguished every trace of fire in his shack. Each trap was left intact but partially reset to mislead. The fortress would remain but empty. As he descended into the forest, he moved with the quiet precision of decades of survival. Branches snapped silently beneath careful weight. Streams were crossed upstream to erase scent. The mountains watched, wind carrying his presence away from hunters below. He was invisible. The first sign of pursuit came hours later, when a distant shout echoed across the ridges. But by then, he had already moved into terrain only he could navigate. A network of hidden paths, steep cliffs, and narrow passes that would confound even the most experienced trackers. One by one, the hunters reached dead ends, traps, and false leads. By the next morning the mountain was empty, the shack remained, hidden, silent, and seemingly untouched. Hunters found it, but no man waited inside. The fires were cold, supplies untouched. Only the faintest traces of movement hinted that someone had been there recently. And yet, no one could confirm what they had seen, or failed to see. For weeks, people scoured the ridges. They called out, fired rifles, sent dogs. Nothing answered. Trees and wind masked every noise. Even experienced trackers, those who had survived previous encounters, began to whisper that he had vanished into air itself. The legend solidified. Some claimed he had died in the forest, choosing obscurity over confrontation. Others swore they had glimpsed him on distant ridges, moving like a shadow, observing, never captured. Hunters told stories of screams and sudden disappearances, attributing them to the mountain man, even when the timeline did not match. Every version was slightly different, every account more terrifying. The shack became the focal point of myth. Travelers passing through the lower valleys told tales of its silhouette, half hidden by shadow and trees, and of the ghostly presence of a man who had mastered the mountains themselves. Children dared each other to venture near, but none stayed long. Adults avoided the ridges entirely, fearing curses or spirits. In the silence of the forest, the man disappeared, but not entirely. He became a memory, a shadow, a force embedded in the mountains themselves. The Blue Ridge held him as tightly as it had once concealed him. He had survived. He had evaded capture. He had turned the shack into a fortress, and now he had left it as a monument. He would not be found, not by hunters, not by law, not by anyone. And in this disappearance, his legend became eternal. Over the following years, Every encounter with hunters, trappers, or curious travelers who ventured too high, every mysterious death or unexplained injury in the ridges, was attributed to him. Even decades later, locals spoke of him in reverent fear, the runaway who had become more than human, a specter that claimed the mountains, and vanished before he could be caught. The line between man and myth blurred. Was he still alive? Had he died somewhere deeper in the mountains, or had he simply chosen to leave humanity behind entirely, existing in harmony with the wilderness? No one could say. What remained was unmistakable, a fortress, a legend, and a story of defiance that no chains, no fear, no system of oppression could erase. The shack stood as a testament to survival, cunning, and the unbreakable will of a man who refused to be owned. And in the mountains, somewhere, he endured a time. Like the rivers cutting through the Blue Ridge Mountains, flowed steadily, indifferent to human desire or memory. Generations came and went, but the mountains retained their secrets. The shack, once alive with the presence of a man who had defied chains, law, and death itself, remained, as silent witness to his legend. To anyone who ventured too close, it appeared as nothing more than a shadow among shadows, a pile of rocks and logs shaped by careful hands, yet imbued with a history that refused to die. The man himself had vanished, leaving behind no trace of his passage, no trace of a life lived beyond the forest. Yet the stories endured. Travelers, merchants, hunters, and the enslaved whispered his name in fear and awe. Some spoke of a figure glimpsed moving like wind through the trees. Others swore they heard footsteps at dawn, yet found no footprints. Every retelling grew in terror and wonder, adding layers to the man's mythic identity. He became something larger than human, something the world below could neither predict nor understand. In his absence, his influence only multiplied. Where he had survived through cunning, knowledge, and patience, others attempted and failed. Where he had vanished, fear and legend filled the void. His story became a lesson whispered to children and hardened adults alike. Freedom was possible, but it required vigilance, intelligence, and an indomitable will. Generations of slaves below the mountains, hearing the stories, clung to them as proof that defiance was possible. The tale of the man in the shack was retold in hushed tones, by candlelight, and in secret spaces where chains could not reach. He became a symbol of rebellion, a living testament that even in the face of oppression one could escape, endure, and transcend. Plantations changed, yet his shadow lingered. Overseers who once boasted of control and dominion began to speak of the Blue Ridge with caution. Hunters and trappers, now educated in fear by rumor, avoided the ridges entirely. Even decades later, someone attempting to measure or map the area would report inexplicable tracks, strange disturbances in the forest, and subtle, fleeting shadows that disappeared the moment one tried to approach. The shack, abandoned yet fortified by his ingenuity, became more than a physical space. It became a monument to autonomy. Nature reclaimed it slowly. Vines and moss grew over the walls and snow buried its roof each winter. Yet every time the forest shifted, every time branches snapped or streams overflowed, it seemed as though the shack remained purposeful, watching. Visitors, or those foolish enough to approach, felt an unseen presence, an awareness that seemed larger than any human being. Some claimed to have glimpsed the man in his later years, silhouetted against the sunrise, moving across a ridge at impossible speed. Others reported seeing footprints that vanished midway, or hearing a voice whisper warnings in the wind, but no one ever captured him. No one ever understood him. In truth, he may have moved beyond the mountains entirely, integrating fully with the wilderness, leaving the shack as his only monument to human ingenuity and willpower. What remained undeniable was the psychological power he had wielded. Fear had been his ally, patience his weapon, and knowledge his shield. He had turned the mountains themselves into a living fortress, teaching humanity a lesson without firing a single rifle. Control could be challenged, oppression could be escaped, and even the strongest chains could not contain a mind determined to be free. Historians and storytellers later examined the legend. Some treated it as folklore, an exaggeration of human imagination, yet others noted consistency in the details, patterns that could not easily be explained by myth alone. Paths, traps, and remains of rudimentary structures aligned with decades-old accounts of disappearances and strange phenomena. Even the physical landscape bore subtle traces of his life. Stone arrangements, camouflaged pits, and carefully carved notches in trees. Signs of a man who had mastered his environment and left behind coded evidence of his presence. He became immortal in stories, a cautionary figure, and a beacon of hope simultaneously. For those in chains he represented defeat. For those who sought to control, he represented terror. For future generations he became a bridge between myth and reality, showing that human ingenuity, courage, and persistence could challenge even the most oppressive forces. Over time, his tale inspired others in subtle, quiet ways. Individuals who had grown up hearing the legend found the courage to escape, to resist, and to challenge injustice in their own lives. Even without ever seeing him, the mountain man's actions echoed in their choices. His physical absence amplified his symbolic presence. He had transcended mortality in the way few humans ever do, through the enduring power of story and the lasting impact of rebellion. The shack, now weathered and partially reclaimed by the forest, still stands today, though few dare approach it. Locals speak of it only in whispers, warning that the mountains are alive with the spirit of a man who refused to be tamed. Some leave offerings at its base, not to a god, but to a legend. They do so in reverence and fear, recognizing a figure who had transformed suffering into survival, mastery, and myth. In the end, the man's legacy is twofold. First, the tangible proof of what one human being can accomplish with patience, intelligence, and determination. Every trap, every path, every structure he built reflects a mind attuned to the wild and impervious to fear. Second, the intangible power of legend. His story endures precisely because it cannot be fully proven, yet cannot be fully denied. It has become a parable, a psychological fortress that outlives the man himself. Freedom, cunning, and resistance exist now not only in the mountains, but in the minds of everyone who hears the tale. He disappeared into the wilderness, leaving no body, no trace, no final act. Yet his presence remains in every shadow, in every rustling leaf, and in every whispered account passed down through generations. In a world that sought to claim him, he claimed something far more lasting, the immortality of resistance, and somewhere high in the ridges the man watches still, not as a conqueror of men but as a master of himself. The shack remains hidden among trees and stone, a silent sentinel to a life lived on the edge of fear and freedom, and the mountains, patient and eternal, keep his secret well. Even now, centuries later, those who climb the ridges report strange sights and sounds, a fleeting shadow at sunrise, the soft crack of a branch when no wind moves, footsteps in snow that appear and vanish. The legend continues, unbroken, a story of human ingenuity, courage, and the indomitable will of a man who refused to be owned, and refused to die in memory. In the end, the mountain man is gone, yet everywhere. His shack stands empty, yet full. His flesh may have faded, but his mind, his cunning, his legacy, and the fear and respect he commanded endure. And so, the story of the man who escaped slavery, mastered the mountains, and became a living legend continues to whisper through the Blue Ridge, forever part of the landscape, forever part of history, forever part of myth.